Good afternoon and welcome to Beyond Deming. I'm joined today by Frank Devine. Frank doesn't like to do introductions because he finds them boring. He likes to let the quality of his work shine through. So instead of introducing Frank, we will just pile in straight into what Frank's going to talk us about. So where should we start, Frank?
Back in 2008, we started a process that's creating a competitive culture from the bottom up inside organizations in Dupuy, part of Johnson & Johnson in Cork in Ireland.
Yeah.
That site went on to win the joint first European Shingo prize. So anyway, one of the senior team was a master's student taught by me and people like John Bacino, etc., at Cardiff. And what he was examining was whether my process effectively and what they did in Cork contributed to the massive improvements that were made on that site. So this was interesting to me because I couldn't get involved because I had a vested interest because it was me that I'd designed and delivered the workshops and trained all the leaders, etc. So anyway, I wasn't told the outcome. I knew he'd got a really good result. And then what Cardiff decided to do was get him to present the results of his dissertation at a conference in front of a big audience in which I was present, but I did not know what he was going to say. So anyway, Bill started and he read out a very boring, long academic title of his dissertation. And then he turned to me and said, or to put it more simply, is Frank talking out his arse? And that's how the actual conference speech was
entitled.
Yeah. And of course, he got a big, my little heart, what's he going to say? And of course, it broke all the ice, everyone laughing. And the good news is there was a strong correlation between what we're going to talk about here and the success of that plant. Anyway, how it all began, though, a long time before that, was that when I was asked as to which organizations I should apply for after university, I got no university background in my family, so I had nobody to talk to from a familial point of view. And the university advised me, because of what I was interested in, leadership and what the best organizations were for developing leaders, they advised me to join either Shell, BP, or Unilever. So the first part of my post-university career was Shell and then Unilever. So I actually took part in both of their graduate leadership programs. In Unilever, when you passed that program, you got exemption from the first year of a 2-year MBA at the stage, to give you an idea of the quality of it. So obviously my expectations were high. I was very enthusiastic coming out of university, supposedly working in the best leadership development graduate program in Europe, but I was really disappointed. What I found was that people on the program, some of them were absolutely top class. They went on to have great careers in both organizations. But also there were some of the worst people I've ever had the displeasure of working with coming out of the same program. A, it was a massive disappointment. B, it was if your process produces that degree of variability, we wouldn't accept it anywhere else. We wouldn't accept a production line that produced good product for 10 minutes and then rubbish and then good product. We would not accept that degree of variability anywhere else. Why do we accept it for leaders? Why do we expect so little from leadership development? And the usual cop-out explanations are things like, people are different, people are varied, they vary across cultures, all of this sort of stuff. Yes, they are different. And all of that variability is fine. But the variability on how an employee is treated, how an employee is developed, how an employee feels getting up and going into work that day on that shift, how they feel about their work is not benign. No individual ever in any organization should ever be concerned if a job comes up about the quality of their boss, that the quality of their boss should be a given. The variability will be reduced upwards, not downwards, not upwards, so that nobody who has responsibility for anyone else is not highly skilled in doing that job to very, very precise standards of what that means and definitions of what that means. So that's the big vision. There must be a way of doing this. And I just looked and looked and looked and looked. And what I found was some things were working very well. They were moving the dial, they were increasing productivity, they were increasing engagement, blah, blah. Other things were not. So the investment in them was not producing a return. And some things were actually damaging. Leaders didn't have a reliable way of knowing which was which. There were things missing in the way we trained leaders, and there were things that we were doing that were counterproductive.
Let me just summarize what you said then, Frank, so I've got it. So you started off, and if I'm right in saying this, you started off actually as an HR professional. Is that
That's
right?
right.
Or personnel, as it would have been called then.
Yeah.
But you went through all this leadership development stuff.
Yeah.
And you were just a bit disappointed by it. So really the challenge for you was to work out what worked
And what doesn't.
and what didn't.
Exactly. And the reason I was directed by Shell into the HR function was because back then, in the late 70s, early 80s, was a period of massive strikes. We had the winter of discontent. So my trade union and student union, I was president at Warwick and things like that, experience was seen as suitable for someone who could handle conflict and negotiations and things like that. So back then, things like leadership development, employee engagement were things we talked about, but in practice, we were tied up with stopping strikes and dealing with all this sort of stuff. So that's how I got into HR. But I am actually a very unusual, or was a very unusual HR guy. Just to give an example of that, I said to my team, our role as HR professionals is not to tell our leaders what they can't do. Our role is to find a legal and effective way of helping them do what they need to do. So it's not the computer says no, it's the computer isn't giving us the result, but we'll work with you and problem solve to find a better result than what the computer's saying. A very service-orientated approach to all the other functions.
So my rather jaundiced view of HR, so having spent 30 plus years in corporate Britain, is that they throw out a lot of initiatives, some of which are helpful, some of which are deeply not helpful. Your point about what works from a leadership development perspective and what doesn't.
Guilty.
Yeah. So how did you how did you go about finding out what worked and what didn't? Well, because most people, HR departments, just seem to follow what's currently in vogue.
Yeah, and there is a problem as well. If you look at the scientific background of most HR people, they will come from either an arts or a social science background rather than a hard science background. So one of the key things in testing what works and what doesn't is data and knowing how to do scientific experiments and et cetera, et cetera. And these are not strengths in the HR function. It doesn't mean there's not really good people who are capable of doing that. But as a generalization, that wouldn't have been a key criteria for promotion and recruitment of people into HR.
Yeah, as a discipline, it's not where they're at.
Yes. Now, that's got better, but the faddism hasn't. We got to do something. This is something. Let's do that. And it can make it worse. Typical topical example recently is the reaction to Black Lives Matter, to that murder of that individual in America by the police officer. The reaction to that among my profession was very poor. In panic, they just reached out for people who write about racism. A lot of the people who write about racism are actual political activists, not helpful to businesses and organizations. But anyway, the process was essentially test it. Let's see what works in practice. So, for example, it was very faddish a few years ago to emphasize body language when talking about how to give people genuine, sincere appreciation. So I tested it. So the way we tested it was we had 4 sites as equal as we could have in terms of engagement, quality of leadership, things like that. So you want to reduce variation as much as possible in an experiment. And we added into 2 of the 4 sites what was regarded as one of the best body language consultancies that existed at the time. And we asked them to focus on, particularly in body language, giving recognition. And then the idea was to just track levels of engagement, but in particular, levels of employee responses to feeling appreciated at work, because that's what recognition is about, not about giving people things. So my intention was to keep this experiment running for about two years. I had to call the experiment off because we were getting such bad results from the two plants that had the body language training.
Okay.
And they were also very funny because I was seeing the numbers going in the wrong direction, but I was also interested in the employee commentary on why,
Yeah.
why they, and there was comments like, I don't know what's happened to the managers recently, but they've become very peculiar. They're acting in a very peculiar way. So the conclusion we drew there was that focusing on body language, it's not adding enough value and potentially could be damaging. And then we gave everybody a very simple guideline. Don't worry about your body. Get your heart in the right place, and your body won't let you down. So just get your intention as to why you're giving recognition. Not giving it because you want something back from something. You're doing it because no employee should be taken for granted at work. And if you stick with that philosophy and learn how to do it properly, you don't need to worry about your body language.
But that's really interesting, Frank, isn't it? Because I have seen lots of initiatives, not just HR initiatives, but lots of initiatives rolled out in organisations. And people get behind them and then they don't back off. Whereas if you go in with the view that I am going to test this, and you've actually said that you're going to test it, then it becomes very easy for you to say, well, that didn't work, but we tried it and we learnt from it. See, there's no loss of face.
Yeah, exactly.
So actually it puts you from a very strong position from the get-go.
Yeah. Now you could argue you shouldn't experiment on your employees, but my argument was we have to test things to try and improve. It's just a scientific method. Now we didn't say to the employees they were part of an experiment, because that has Hawthorne effects. We didn't even say to the managers in the local plants we were doing that. We just offered them this additional training. We asked them to do it by a certain date and then stood back and watched. We didn't want to in any way influence the outcome of what was happening. But that process of what works, identify this is moving the dial, right? We consolidate that. If something's not working the dial, hypothesis then, what do we know? And not just psychology, but also from other areas. What do we know about from, for example, elite sports? What do we know from medicine? What do we know from acting? What do we know from social anthropology that might work here? And just being open to doing that. But that's the approach. The approach is, first of all, Pareto, the concept of a Pareto break, or if you like, argument dilution. So if we do this additional intervention, will it actually add value, or because it's taking time away from higher up on the Pareto interventions, is it dilutive?
What did you learn then, Frank? That's what really interests me. So you looked at all these different things, and then presumably you had stuff that worked. But what did you come to the conclusion not so much didn't work, but didn't work as well then?
I think the key conceptual thing is, first of all, to see leadership as a system. So to apply systems thinking to leadership, not to see it as a collection of specialist interventions taught by subject matter experts narrowly academically in their own field, but to see it as an interactive system. And therefore, when you look at leadership as a system, you're much more conscious of all the things that relate to each other. You're much more aware of unintended consequences. You're much more aware of the way you can leverage one skill against another.
So you developed a model then to put all of this together called the
Cathedral Model. So the concept of the model is that above the Pareto break, so the stuff that turns the dials, how can we teach that to leaders as a system, as an interactive system, and emphasize that other stuff is probably in isolation possibly valuable. But when you allow the other stuff to dilute the impact of your Pareto, you're actually making yourself accidentally less effective. So the discipline to stop doing things. And by the way, this was career threatening, because corporate was telling me to do stuff, and I was saying, well, I can't see any evidence that it's working. So why should I waste the time of my leaders? I've got a better way of doing it as well. So this was not good career-wise, because I'm talking to my own bosses in the learning and development.
I have some sympathy for being in that position, Frank.
Yeah. So what I did was, and I'm not recommending this to any young person listening to this for their career, but what I did was I just agreed and then ignored them. and then showed them afterwards, and that there can be some dangers in that. Okay, so I'm not recommending it. So the idea was, can we distill the things we know work? So for example, within recognition, that's taught what works and what doesn't work and why.
So let me cut across, Frank, because let's get to the juicy bit.
Go on then.
Because I'm dying to know. So what did you find that really you thought this is not helping? What are the things which, given your systematic view, you'd advise people to think very strongly about? Don't do these things.
Outcomes, if you like. So for example, teaching coaching in isolation is actually dangerous. What happens is people then deploy coaching in situations where they need to do constructive feedback, or sometimes they need to just intervene and stop the person doing what they're doing because it's dangerous. So knowing how the actual skills in leadership, first of all, what are the most important ones above the Pareto break? But then, are there sequence effects? Are things more effective when they're done before or after? So to give you an example, just a simple example, if someone's emotional and you deploy logic, what chance has your logic got? So you've got to get the emotion to down. So you have to use specific techniques, acknowledgement, selective agreement, reframing, just to name three, to create the curiosity and the openness for your logic to have a chance of affecting the other human being. So the same thing you say after applying acknowledgement, selective agreement, and reframing can be very, very effective. But if you say it before doing that, you're wasting your time and you're probably irritating the other person. So knowing about not just a whole series of random tools and techniques, but understanding how to create, in that case, how to create curiosity. So you're really mad at me and I say, you know something, James, if I was in a situation that you're in, I'd be pretty irritated also. You're not expecting me to say that. So immediately you're curious. Once you're curious, you're open now to what's coming next. Game of Thrones, the last thing in the first series of Game of Thrones, the big star that everyone knows about is probably watching it because of him, gets his head chopped off. What did that do to anticipation to the second series of Game of Thrones? And if you look at the viewer, it's the same thing. And that's learning from, if you like, people who are involved in the arts, people who know how to write plays, people who know how to do films, people who know how to write music and poetry. We can learn from those guys.
What you're saying is, as far as the Cathedral Model goes, there's an important sequence.
Yes.
But you're getting me off the topic, Frank. What I'm really interested in is what you found that didn't work. So what else would you say? Well,
for example, let me give you an example. Many organizations train their employees in resilience. It's a tough market out there. It's a tough world we're in at the moment. There's a lot of bad things going on. And organizations, in response to that, are training their people to be more resilient. To me, that's useful. But it's a typical example of treating a symptom rather than a root cause. So application of improvement science to leadership. So what's the root cause of people feeling stressed out, overworked, etc.? It's something called overcommitment. So in the Cathedral Model, that issue is not addressed by resilience training. It's addressed by going to the source of overcommitment, people self-diagnosing where their overcommitment comes from. Sometimes it's from themselves. High performers often do it to themselves. Sometimes it's from their boss or colleagues or corporate or customers, whatever it is, but identifying all the causes of it and then addressing those causes using a systematic improvement process. So in the Cathedral model, there's nothing on resilience because you don't need all your employees to be resilient. Our duty of care is to create an environment where people can perform very highly without burning them out. We don't need to exploit our people to get high levels of performance. So that's a root cause analysis.
So
So
if you think the solution is to put some fruit on some worktops, you're sadly mistaken, is really what we're
yeah,
saying. Yeah, all those types of initiatives which are
yeah.
just addressing the symptom.
My specialism is engagement and enablement of employees. And the number of organizations who think, like you say, let's give them, to get people to come back into the office, let's give them nice coffee, let's have pool tables. Nothing wrong with that. But the key thing is, if I want to go to work, if I'm passionate about doing my work, if I know that I'm going to enjoy the exchanges with my colleagues dealing with issues that I'm going to learn from, I want to get to work. I don't care about the coffee. Obviously, you have to pay properly. You have to decide where you want to be in the market, but don't try and buy engagement with money. Get into the weeds on this. Find out what drives people. For example, all this stuff about generations Z, Z, however you pronounce it, and they're all being very political at work and all this snowflakes and all that. No, no, no. They're simply, they want a purpose. And the problem is the only people offering it tend to be political activists. So that's why they get off on stuff that's very unhelpful. If an organization genuinely has higher purpose, engages and enables its workforce, has top-class management, and is therefore contributing to the society in which it's based, kids can buy into that. That's what they want. So rather than criticizing them for being activists, let's give them something that's non-political and worthwhile that they can buy into.
So if we go into the cathedral model, and so if people who are watching this on YouTube or on video, here is a picture of the model for you to see. But let's, unfortunately, not everybody's doing that. So just talk me through your systematic view, Frank. How should it work?
It's in the form of a cathedral because of a famous story about the two bricklayers, which I won't retell, but many people know it. When asked what are they doing, well, one gives a purpose answer and one gives a different kind of answer.
Building a cathedral,
yeah. But it's also because at the time, you've got to go back now to the 80s, the quality movement often described things with columns. That's kind of house, like we had the House of Quality, for example.
I remember the House of Quality very well.
So hard scientists who regarded a lot of the stuff coming out of L&D and the HR department as, in their words, soft shit. I needed to present something in a format that was, if you like, familiar. And they took other things in that format credibly, and I wanted them to take leadership credibly as well. So that's why it's displayed, if you like, as a foundation with columns, which are the leadership skills. It starts at the bottom. The foundation is what provides the purpose and the values that influence your application of these skills. So that's why you've got purpose in there. Where the employees have designed their own culture, we call that behavioral standards, because it's local. It's in the language of the local site. It's a differentiator locally. It's not an integration like a corporate set of values is an integration across lots of sites. But in the foundation, it's the local culture as designed by the employees. All of the employees design this. It's not designed by HR, by management. It's designed by everybody.
So you start off with really being very clear about values and purpose and what is an acceptable way to behave. Because if you haven't got that in place, nobody will want to work there anyway.
And not just an acceptable way to behave, James. The behaviors that will drive what the organization is trying to achieve. So it's not soft stuff.
Yeah.
So
could you give me an example,
Yeah,
Frank?
I'll give you a real example. In one particular site, it was a medical devices site. So obviously quality of products crucial, because if you put medical devices into people's bodies, you can kill them. But the reaction on the site to quality issues was people were marched up where there was a problem. People were marched off the line. They had to prove they weren't guilty to get their job back. And you can imagine how humiliating that felt. So when we were in the workshops with the employees, this issue was the top issue that came through to the eventual joint meeting, which decides what the company's change plan is going to be between senior management and the employees. And then when we were doing the culture to drive a different approach to mistakes, there was no point saying we have a no blame culture. Because I mean, how can you measure that? How can you test that? So the particular behavioral standard that was created was, and watch how it works. See if you can see how easy this is to measure in practice if you're watching someone's behavior. When something goes wrong, so it's not all the time, it's in these particular circumstances. When something goes wrong, we ask, what happened? Why did it happen? How do we make sure that doesn't happen again? And we don't ask, who did it? Now, every supervisor, every manager, every person can observe a conversation going on and test it when a mistake's happened, can test it against that standard. So the fact that the employees prioritized it as number one problem, the fact that the employees created it as their number one behavioral standard, had a massive effect on quality on the site. Now, other organizations have made the mistake of liking that particular behavioral standard and trying to bring it in top down elsewhere. But
But
when
it wasn't relevant to their context, so it really didn't.
it's probably always relevant because it's a good problem solving approach, but it didn't have the emotional power of the employees saying, we said that, we created that, that's ours. So that's the foundation. Now it goes left to right. So the order matters because it's a system. So recognition is before coaching, is before constructive feedback, for example. But it starts on the left with setting expectations. So the sequence of the more, if you like, usual leadership skills is you have to set expectations first. So if you look at the Gallup study on their 12 questions, which one most strongly correlates with high engagement, knowing exactly what I'm expected to do was what came out of that big study. So you set expectations, but while you're doing that, you manage overcommitment, because a large part of overcommitment comes when people are set work to do. And that's where you can pare it away and make it much better at that stage. So it's you set expectations and you manage your overcommitment at the same time.
And can you give me an example of that, Frank? Managing overcommitment.
Right.
How would somebody?
For example, the Elizabethan line in London, original design spec for the organization doing the tunnels and the stations was very high spec paint, because that line strategically, the government at the time, I think it was Johnson at the time, wanted anybody coming into the UK, so inward investors, tourists, to have every station they stopped in to see something that would display the UK in a very good light. So the spec for those stations is very high spec. So we took a practical example for overcommitment. So I just said to them, what's the paint spec for the tunnels, compared to the stations? And they all looked at me and said, the paint spec is the same, very high quality paint. So I said, how hard wearing is that paint? And he said, no, it's not very, it's poor. Compared to the paint you'd normally use in tunnels, how often would you have to maintain it? So at least 2, possibly 3 times more often. What's its price? What's it cost? It's massively more expensive. So when you go back to the customer and say you can save them a lot of money and reduce their maintenance costs, and they did. And so, but the point about that was that was overcommitment in the sense of all the extra work that would have had to be done to maintain those tunnels because they were using a spec that was not
Well,
appropriate.
yeah, and presumably it's dark in the tunnel, so nobody flipping
Nobody's ever
sees
going
it
to see it
anyway.
anyway. Yeah. So that's overcommitment. Then you have to make sure that nobody in your organization feels taken for granted. There's a lot of people who are taken for granted. High performers, people adjust to their high performers and kind of expect more from them because of their previous record, rather than appreciating that they're above the standard and doing great stuff. But there's also hidden heroes, people who quietly stop things going wrong. So management don't even know what they've done. How many Employee of the Month awards do they get? By the way, that's why I abolished recognition schemes and stuff like that, unknown to corporate for many, many years, but put in something stronger and bottom up based. So you make sure people are not taken for granted. Then you use coaching not as a remedial tool that's in the HR disciplinary procedure, coaching as a way of systematically developing every human being in the business. Coaching not confined to executives to get executive coaching, but coaching for everyone, delivered by lots of people who've been trained in coaching. A number of my clients, we've trained the entire workforce how to coach, not a minority skill for top people, a skill that every employee can use to improve.
And that's interesting because in reality, if you sit back and think about it, you want all your employees to get better. But what
Yeah,
most
exactly.
organizations do, they
Exactly.
look at the bottom bit and they slap them about. They look at the top bit and they might give them some coaching. And the people in the middle just get ignored. So
But
you're missing a huge opportunity.
also, the kind of position coaching as remedial. If you put coaching into your disciplinary procedure, you're saying to people, if you're bad, you get coached. So it actually creates a negative attitude towards coaching, you know. But anyway, so that coaching delegation column is crucial, and it's interesting how it drives recognition, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Then things will go wrong. Constructive feedback deals with it quickly and assertively, but maintaining the relationship. And if all that fails, you get into escalation, which is things like the disciplinary procedure. Now,
But you don't get into that unless all the other stuff has been.
well, you can have severe conduct issues. So if I come into work and hammer someone over the head with a hammer, I'm not going to go through recognition, coaching, constructive feedback before being suspended. You know, so in the absence of severe conduct issues or repeat offenses, then you're always going to try and approach the issue once you've diagnosed it properly in the appropriate part of the Cathedral Model. So the Cathedral Model gives you a diagnostic tool as well. You look at it and say, where is this problem? Where are we in this problem? If I haven't set the expectation properly in the first column, what right have I got you to give you constructive feedback for not meeting a standard you don't know about? So I have to set the standard before I can give constructive feedback about failure to hit the standard.
But that makes sense to me, Frank. So I can see that that's all systematic, as you put it.
Yeah.
The one thing that you haven't got in there that most organizations will go through is this sort of every 6-month round of appraisal and putting people in boxes and things like that.
Yeah.
So does that work with this, or where's your?
You don't need it. I mean, the key issue about appraisal is what's it for? And just to give you an idea, a few years ago when I studied it, when I was back in corporate life, so that's 25 years ago, I got the suppliers to do market research for me on the expenditure on appraisal on the one hand, and recognition, coaching, and constructive feedback, the three core central parts of the Cathedral Model combined in 1 year in the UK training spend across the UK. What do you think the ratio was?
Oh, I would imagine the vast majority of time was spent on appraisal and very little was done.
4-1. So we spent 4 times more on appraisal than the combined total that we were spending on recognition, coaching, and constructive feedback. Now, if you see a book,
and actually, sorry to pile in then, Fran, but appraisal is pretty much just an after an event. Is that after the effect?
well, it can be done well. I mean, it can be done well, and I'm not saying it has no value, but its comparative value is what happens. So if nobody's been taken for granted, you're given high quality, sincere recognition all the time in when appropriate. You're coaching, lots and lots of coaching is going on, and anything goes off track, you deal with it with constructive feedback. the appraisal becomes very simple. You just look back on all these other conversations and you have a little debate about it, and then you set your objectives for the year to come. So that's useful. But it's the foundations have to be in place to make it useful. And therefore it doesn't hit the Pareto. So my strong steer is make sure your recognition, coaching, constructive feedback, you're setting expectations, you're managing overcommitment is humming, and your appraisal will be fine. But you will find you probably don't need as much paperwork, you won't need as much time, it'll be a much simpler situation, and people will engage with the process better anyway. So you may not abolish it, but you de-emphasize it compared to the building blocks, if you like. It's like I work in elite sport and stuff like that. So if you get your football players passing the ball well, moving well, running well, jumping well, heading the ball well, supporting each other well, yeah, you do a review of the game afterward. But if you get all those things right, you've got a good chance of doing well in the game.
Yes.
If you just look at the result, don't look at the scorecard, look at what's going on the pitch. Now, accountability coaching didn't exist. So it was managing overcommitment, I had to invent it. And simplified for this audience, if a Deming audience, accountability coaching is similar to the check act part of plan, do, check, act. So you're looking at what did you expect to happen with a standard? It could be a standard leadership, could be financial standard, could be quality, any standard. What would you expect to happen with that standard in place? What did happen? And then you react to any difference between what was expected to happen and what did happen by bringing it back to the standard. But you also react when there's no difference, when the person's done a really good job. Your reaction there is recognition. So you derive both the quantity and the quality of recognition from those conversations, and you therefore maintain all your standards, not just your leadership standards, all the standards in the organization through accountability coaching.
But there's the key point then, is it? It's the quality and quantity line.
And that's why you need training. So the Cathedral Model process is 6 workshops over 9 months, where people have it's a tough day. People say their brain hurts at the end, but they do a tough day in the workshop, but then they go and do it for 6 weeks. Then they get tested on how well they've done, and then they do the next section. Every 6 weeks, we found over time, again with experimentation, was the sweet spot between memory loss problems and giving busy people the chance in their busy lives to be able to apply what they've just learned. So 6 one-day workshops over 9 months was what we found was the best model.
Well, let's just expand on that a wee bit, Frank, for me then. So how do you get people to adopt this model? So 6 workshops. So how does that play?
Well, first of all, you don't say there's going to be an executive summary stuff, and then there's going to be middle management, senior management, middle management, then supervisors. Don't do that. You can't model what you want your people to do unless you're doing it yourself. And you can't do it unless you understand the technical detail of how to give recognition properly to get the right results, the technical detail of how to coach properly and not turn it into psychoanalysis. So you can't do that unless you do the same training as everyone else. So the leadership team, typically at site level, will do phase 1. 6 weeks later, their managers, all different levels, will do the same phase 1, and they will be asked at the end of their phase 1, have they noticed any difference in the behavior of their senior leaders? They will give feedback upwards. So the accountability is not just downwards, the accountability is upwards. And that first accountability session I have with the senior leaders who do phase 2 the next day, and I give them the feedback. And some of that feedback can be, guys, I'm not seeing enough results here. It's not about signing a check and walking away. If you're not leading this by example, we're wasting money here. I'm happy to walk away from it. I have walked away from it. But you've got to take it seriously. You have to lead by example, and you have to make a difference to show that you're sincere about what you're doing. It's not for them. It's for you. And I have sometimes some difficult conversations there with people say, oh, well, busy executives, they haven't got time to do this. So if you haven't got time to do this, it's not going to work anyway. So I'm not prepared to do it unless you invest in it by making the changes in your own behavior that you're asking people below you in the organization to do, it's not going to work. And I won't do it.
You've written a book, Frank, called Rapid Mass Engagement.
That's right. Yeah. So
how do you persuade a senior business manager that this stuff works and they're getting bang for their buck?
Well, partly there's two reasons for writing the book. One was to leave behind, if you like, by way of legacy, a guide to how all this works with the demonstrated case studies from organizations all over the world in different sectors. I was offered the first book contract in the year 2000. I wouldn't do it because I didn't believe, from a scientific point of view, the sample size was big enough. There wasn't enough sectors. There weren't enough parts of the world tested. So the book was published in 2023. By that stage, over those 23 years, the sample size is much bigger. The actual experiments, if you like, go on longer. And we're covering, for example, more than 30 states in the United States, parts of Asia, Africa, etc. So the evidence base is out there. Mostly, leaders come to it by going to sites where they've seen it. Mostly, it comes through word of mouth.
So people hear about the Cathedral Model and they understand that it works and then they want to try it out. But this is part of the Rapid Mass Engagement program. And that really, or can be, and that really is where employees get involved and start to modify their organization and deliver the financial improvements that most senior leaders want, which of course is why you go into a lot of this leadership and development for the first place.
Well, the two things kind of happen in parallel, but I was frustrated with leadership development and offer as a customer for many years. Yeah. So the leadership stuff was being developed, and then the engagement material was also developed as a method of rapidly transforming the culture and performance of organization, transforming or keeping a site, for example, ahead of all the other sites. So some of my clients were already the best site globally, but they weren't complacent. They wanted to stay ahead and get further ahead. So that's where rapid mass engagement comes in.
So if we want to learn about rapid mass engagement, Frank, what's the best way?
Get the book, or look at my website, or just put my name in, and you'll get lots of stuff on it. Or maybe I could come back and do another podcast if you were interested.
Try and twist your arm, Frank.
Do another one. I don't need much twisting. I like talking to you, James.
Lovely. Super. Thank you very much for talking to us, Frank. I do appreciate it.